actual heads may not roll this time, only metaphorical ones. And although this is a historic day for the Constitution, what will actually change? Well, with me now is Barrister Martin Howe, Chairman for Pro-Brexit Group Lawyers of Britain, and Catherine Haddon, the Institute for Government's resident historian and constitutionalist. Welcome to you both. Catherine, let me start with you.
Yep.
The Attorney General has said that his judgment was in good faith, that he considered it very carefully and said the suspension of Parliament would be lawful and constitutional. Does that make him a bad lawyer?
It's difficult to say. But the thing is, the Supreme Court have now ruled on this, but before that, we had no such thing. So this is the first time that a court has got into this thorny area of both this particular royal prerogative power and also this question about the role of Parliament. So it's the court also saying what has happened in Parliament, saying that Parliament is not prorogued and ruling effectively that this prorogation never happened. And that's new territory. So, you know, it may be that the Attorney General therefore looks back on that and says, in good faith, that was my interpretation, but there is now a ruling and it was unlawful.
I mean, it's amazing to consider that this court that we're all talking about today is only 10 years old. I think it was founded almost exactly 10 years ago, October 2009. And we didn't really know an awful lot about it. Were you surprised by the unanimity of this verdict?
Personally, I was, because there's a big contrast between this ruling and the previous ruling of the English High Court, headed by the Lord Chief Justice, that said there's actually no objective legal standard by which you can judge whether or not...
But it agreed with the Scottish court, didn't it? So
it agreed with the Scottish court. But the English court pointed out, English High Court pointed out there was no legal standard by which you can judge political reasons, and indeed the courts are not apt people to judge political reasons. And what's happened, and I agree with you on this point, the Supreme Court has actually created a rule of law that did not previously exist. And it's written down in paragraph 50 of its judgment.
OK, sadly, we haven't got time to read paragraph 50 of the judgment. But are you basically saying that this court has become politicised?
I wouldn't use the word politicised. I certainly think it's become activist. And I think the problem...
Activist? And that's quite a loaded term, isn't it?
I think the problem they've now got themselves into is weighing what are good and bad political reasons, because they concluded there was no good reason for this prorogation. Now, there's an obvious and very good reason. Some people may not agree with it, and that is to prevent Parliament mucking up the delicate negotiations between the Prime Minister and the European Union, pending the summit.
But doesn't this ruling, doesn't the existence of this court show that in the middle of a constitutional crisis, this is precisely what we need in this country?
I mean, it's important to remember they didn't sort of speak to the issue about the Prime Minister's intent about this. They talked about the effect that it had had. And they were also quite clear that it was that the government had not made the case as to why it is not doing the things they said, which is affecting Parliament's ability to legislate, affecting Parliament's ability to scrutinise. But it was very new that they were saying that Parliament and the supremacy of Parliament is really important, and the executive should not have the power to be able to stymie that. That was very new.
Now, Boris Johnson originally said when he suspended Parliament, it's got nothing to do with Brexit, it's about the Queen's speech, we need to create a bit of time here. Today, he said, actually, this is the people who are opposed to Brexit are trying to thwart the will of the people expressed in the referendum. He has made it very political, this judgment, hasn't he?
Well,
and he's made it about Brexit.
I'm afraid I don't think he's made it political. I think that the whole case was political all along. Of course.
But isn't that dangerous for this country? No, if you start politicising the courts, rightly or wrongly, who are going to be the neutral arbiters, of our constitution?
Indeed, I think the problem with this case is those who have forced the courts down this road of taking inherently political decisions are those who've brought these challenges. And I'm afraid I think the Supreme Court have been unwise to go down the road of adjudicating on these highly political questions.
Catherine, I spent a lot of time in America where, of course, the Supreme Court, is supreme, and it's incredibly political because these are political appointments that have to be approved by Congress. Are we going to see the same thing in this country? An enormous amount of scrutiny and interest in who sits on the Supreme Court.
On the appointment process, I think we're a way off that. On this question about whether or not you know, the Supreme Court should get into this. It's not just about that. You've got to also examine who's bringing cases now. We have opened up this whole new area where actually the courts are playing a role in sort of political opposition and so forth, or being asked to by those who are opposed. And I don't think you can sort of draw that back. People want a constitutional authority, and in the absence of Parliament or the government doing it, where else do you turn but the courts?
Just very briefly, Annunziata Rees-Mogg, Brexit Party MEP, sister of, tweeted today that, does anyone know how these judges voted in the referendum? That's unacceptable, isn't it?
Well, I don't think we should get into that. And I don't think that the courts operate on the basis of deciding cases because of the way they voted. I think there are broader issues to do with the underlying ethos of those who are appointed to the judiciary, which perhaps are more relevant. I think it's probably long overdue that we should remember, as you pointed out, the Supreme Court is only about 10 years old. It was created by the Blair government as a result of a ram raid on the previous constitution. And I think we need to look carefully again at the effect of those reforms.
And I'm sure we will. Martin Howard, Catherine Haddon, thank you very much indeed.